This week, I've been thinking a lot about compassion and also about forgiveness. Forgiveness is another one of the 8 pillars of joy identified by the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu in their collaborative work, The Book of Joy. As I was pondering forgiveness, how difficult it is, the role of forgiveness in accessing our deep-rooted joy, I found myself reaching for the Book of Jonah. Jonah is a very intriguing book, a story of a runaway prophet. You know, the one swallowed by the whale. There are so many different ways to approach this story, many different ways to interpret it, and each time I pick up the Book of Jonah, it holds something new for me to wrestle with. First, let's just get a quick overview of the story. Called by God to deliver an important message to the people of Nineveh, Jonah decided to go the other way. Jonah boarded a ship that was headed in the opposite direction of Nineveh, and of course, God relentlessly pursued Jonah with each step. God appointed a storm to disrupt the ship in which Jonah was traveling. In an effort to calm the storm, the sailors on the ship tossed Jonah into the sea, which calmed the storm. And then, of course, the part that we all remember, Jonah was swallowed by a great fish and was inside the belly of the fish for 3 days. And then he was spit up on dry land that just happened to be Nineveh. Once again, God sent Jonah into Nineveh with a message. Now, based on the measly effort that Jonah put into the delivery of this message, it is incredibly surprising that God's message turned things around for Nineveh. Jonah said one sentence, 40 days more, and Nineveh shall be overthrown, fulfilled his obligation, and then left. Surprisingly, the Ninevites heard these sparse words and repented. It says all of the city, from the most to the least privileged, everyone, all of Nineveh humbled themselves before God and received God's mercy, which is exactly what Jonah was afraid of. Jonah didn't want God's mercy for Nineveh. He didn't think that was right at all. You see, Nineveh was the capital of Assyria, the violent, aggressive neighbors of Israel who overtook the northern kingdom of Israel during the 8th century BCE. Jonah had an abundance of reasons to hold contempt for Nineveh. Jonah feared that God would have mercy on these evil people. And in Jonah chapter 4, verses 1 through 11, we read this. Jonah thought this was utterly wrong. He became angry. He prayed to the Lord, "Come on, Lord, wasn't this precisely my point when I was back in my own land? This is why I fled to Tarshish earlier. I know you are merciful and compassionate God, very patient, full of faithful love, and willing not to destroy. At this point, Lord, you may as well take my life from me, because it would be better for me to die than to live." The Lord responded, "Is your anger a good thing?" But Jonah went out from the city, and he sat down in the east of the city. There he made himself a hut and sat in it, in the shade, to see what would happen to the city. Then the Lord God provided a shrub, and it grew up over Jonah, providing shade for his head and saving him from his misery. Jonah was very happy about the shrub. But God provided a worm the next day at dawn, and it attacked the shrub, so it died. When the sun rose, God provided a dry east wind, and the sun beat down on Jonah's head, so he became faint. He begged that he might die, saying, "It would be better for me to die than to live." God said to Jonah, "Is your anger about the shrub a good thing?" And Jonah said, "Yes, my anger is good, even to the point of death." But the Lord said, "You pitied the shrub, for which you didn't work and which you didn't raise, it grew in a night and perished in a night. And yet for my part, can't I pity Nineveh, the great city in which there are more than 120,000 people who can't tell their right hand from their left, and also many animals? The end. This question is the end of the book of Jonah. It stops right there. It ends with God basically asking the question, can't I pity your enemy, one whom I've also created? What a question. What are we to do with this? The Israelites had been hurt, attacked, taken over by Assyria. The pain ran deep. So what does it mean for Jonah, or for Israel, or for us, if God cares for and desires what is good for our enemy? This week, as I've been pondering compassion and blessing and forgiveness with Ray Hinton and the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu as guides, I've been thinking about how all three of these men embody compassion, how all three of these men have experienced trauma and loss and oppression beyond my comprehension. And all three have experienced things I can't even imagine forgiving. And yet, last week we focused on compassion, and for Ray Hinton, compassion became like a life raft. He'd been locked away for 3 years within his own anger and bitterness. He'd been consumed with thoughts of vengeance, thoughts of taking his own life and the life of his prosecutor, Bob McGregor. And anyone who reads his story can completely understand why. His feelings of rage and revenge seem as natural as breathing in his situation. No one would blame him. It wasn't right. He was innocent and yet incarcerated, awaiting the day the state of Alabama would take his life at the time of their choosing. Ray was locked in this dark space until the night that another man's cry penetrated the hard shell that Ray had built around his heart. And compassion helped him to reconnect with his own humanity. Compassion just cracked open the door to his humanity and to the humanity of the others who were around him. And this allowed for connection. Ray went on to build the most unlikely friendships on death row. I wanted to share another excerpt from Ray's book with you today. At this point in the story, Ray and his new friends had been researching their cases, and they were talking about the hopes that they had for their appeals. Money determined everything, and none of us had any money. I was showering next to a guy named Jimmy that night when he said, "Hayes has money. If everyone's going to get out of this place, it's Hayes." "Who's Hayes?" I asked. Henry Hayes, the KKK guy. You know the KKK has money. He will get out." I walked back to my shower in shock. I knew who Henry Hayes was. Everybody in Alabama knew that he and a couple of other white guys had lynched a black boy named Michael Donald in Mobile in 1981. The kid had been a teenager, 19 years old, and the KKK was mad that a black guy on trial might get away with killing a white policeman. I thought it had been a mistrial, but couldn't remember. Henry Hayes' father was rumored to be the head of the KKK or something. That poor Donald boy had been randomly picked up and beaten and stabbed and then hung from a tree like a piece of meat for his mother to find. She had sued the Klan or taken some other legal action. I couldn't remember exactly, but I remember being sickened by the murder. Michael Donald hadn't been much younger than I was, 5 or 6 years, and the story had reminded me of the bombs growing up and the kids who had the dogs let loose on them, and the girls who had been murdered in the church. The news about the lynching angered me. I had no idea that my friend Henry was actually Henry Hayes. I went back to my cell that night, staring at the ceiling. I was Henry's friend. He knew I was Black. I wanted to talk to him. I wanted to understand. "Henry," I yelled. "What do you want, Ray?" "I just figured out who you are." I didn't know. There was no answer right away, and I wondered what Henry was thinking. "Everything my mom and dad taught me was a lie, Ray. Everything they taught me against Blacks, it was a lie." I didn't know exactly what to say back to him. You know, just about everything I believe about people, I learned from my mom. "So you know what I mean," he said. "Yeah, I do. I guess I was just lucky that my mom taught me to love people no matter what. She taught me to forgive." "You was lucky, Ray. You was really lucky. She taught me to have compassion for everybody, Henry, and I have compassion for you. I'm sorry your mama and daddy didn't teach you the same. I really am." "Me too." On the next visiting day, Henry had a visit too. I sat with Lester and Sylvia, and we were laughing about something when I heard Henry call my name. "Ray, Ray, come here for a second." He gestured me over. He sat with an older couple I assumed were his parents. I glanced toward the table, but he wasn't paying me any. I glanced toward the guard, but he wasn't paying me any mind, so I walked over to Henry's table. "Ray, I want you to meet my father, Benny." "Dad, this is Ray Hinton, my friend." I held out my hand to Henry's father. He just looked at me and then down at the table. He didn't say hello, and he wouldn't shake my hand. "He's my friend, my best friend." Henry's voice shook a little. His mom smiled faintly, and then the guard yelled at me to go sit down. "Nice to meet you both," I said, and I walked back to my table. "What was that all about?" asked Lester. "That was some progress, my friend. Some crazy progress on death row." Just think that this story is incredible. I have yet to read that part without wanting to cry. Cry for both of them, for the compassion that Ray had for another human being who had brought violence and fear into Ray's own community, and for the humanity experienced by Henry when a friend refused to reduce him to the worst part of his story. From here, Ray started a book club on the row. He got permission to meet with a group of 6 men, including Henry. They read James Baldwin's book, Go Tell It on the Mountain. They read I Know Why the Caged Bird Sing and To Kill a Mockingbird. They had deep, engaging discussions with each other. They found humanity on death row. Ray's is such a powerful witness of choosing humanity and compassion and love and joy in the most unlikely of places. Ray's is a story of compassion and forgiveness when his anger was completely justified. For Jonah, the story just kind of leaves us hanging. He had yet to experience this compassion as a life raft the way that Ray had. Jonah was angry at God for being the kind of God that would forgive such inequity. Jonah was sitting in the heat of the sun because he had hoped from that vantage he would be able to witness the destruction of Nineveh. Perhaps he was hoping that seeing someone who had hurt him hurting would bring him joy. But so far, if Jonah was looking for joy, he hadn't found it. The mercy shown to Nineveh was so vexing to Jonah that he said he would rather die than live through this. Throughout the story, it's clear that Jonah would rather die than bless the Ninevites with God's message. Jonah knew too much about God. God is loving and forgiving, and Jonah just couldn't stand God's mercy extending toward his enemy. Jonah was miserable, and God asked, "Is your anger a good thing?" You know, sometimes when I read Jonah, I am so hard on him. Really, Jonah? Get it together. How could he be so hard-hearted? Why does God extending blessing beyond Israel to Nineveh make Jonah so angry? What does it matter to Jonah if God cares also for Jonah's enemies? Sometimes when I read Jonah, I am so hard on him. I mean, he really is a very unsympathetic character in the Bible, and we're left to wonder if he ever comes around. Sometimes when I am being really hard on Jonah, I think it's because I recognize that same tendency within myself. The tendency to demand accountability for others while desiring grace for myself. I wonder what happened to Jonah after the question, "Can't I pity your enemy, whom I also created?" I wonder how Jonah found his way forward. Did he ever make peace with God's mercy for Nineveh? Or did he remain unforgiving and allow his joy to wither under the conditions of his bitterness and anger? Ray could have continued to be bitter and angry and unforgiven, and no one would blame him for it. And yet his story is a witness to another way, a way of profound forgiveness. Alabama has always been God's country to me, and it always will be. I love Alabama, but I don't love the state of Alabama. Since my release, not one prosecutor or state attorney general or anyone having anything to do with my conviction has apologized. I doubt they ever will. I forgive them. I made a choice after those first difficult few weeks at Lester's, when everything was new and strange and the world didn't seem to make sense to me. I chose to forgive. I chose to stay vigilant to any signs of anger or hate in my heart. They took 30 years of my life. If I couldn't forgive, if I couldn't feel joy, that would be like giving them the rest of my life. The rest of my life is mine. Alabama took 30 years. That was enough. McGregor passed away and he wrote a book before he died. He mentions me in the book and says how evil I am, how clever a killer I was, how he knew just from looking at me that I was guilty. I forgive him. Someone taught him to be racist, just as someone taught Henry Hayes. They are two sides of the same coin. I forgive Reggie, I forgive Purix, and I forgive Akers, and I forgive Judge Garrett and every attorney general who fought to keep the truth from being revealed. I forgive the state of Alabama for being a bully. You have to stand up to bullies. I forgive because not to forgive would only hurt me. I forgive because that's how my mom raised me. I forgive because I have a God who forgives. Ray has illustrated for me several things about forgiveness and its relationship to joy. First of all, forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. Ray continues to tell his story, traveling around the world, using his witness to bring about good. Forgiveness doesn't mean backing down from demands for justice. Ray is a vocal opponent of the death penalty and continues to use his life and his voice to work for criminal justice reform. Forgiveness is not weakness. It is the ultimate in strength. I cannot even imagine the strength it takes for Ray to keep vigilant to resentment, hate, and anger that would steal his joy. I cannot imagine the strength that it takes to say, I forgive them, about unrepentant people and systems who stole 30 years of his life. Desmond Tutu, in the Book of Forgiving, poses that if forgiveness is made contingent on the offending party acknowledging or apologizing or changing in some way, the power remains with the perpetrator, and the victim remains locked in chains to which they have just handed the keys to their offender. Forgiveness that is not conditional is a gift that a victim gives to themselves, and this gift sets them free. Had Ray waited for an apology or an admission of guilt, he would most likely still be waiting, the fullness of his joy on hold. Forgiveness is a process that can't be forced or rushed or demanded. Forgiveness places the power back in the hands of victims, not to hold over the other, but to release themselves and the other in the process. In forgiveness, we also recognize that we have things that need to be forgiven. Desmond Tutu often points out that we might like to think that if we were in a certain situation that we would never behave the way someone did, but we can never truly know. We all have the capacity for incredible goodness and also to do incredible harm. This seems to be a pattern in the Bible. We can see how the oppressed can easily become the oppressor given the right circumstance. Compassion and forgiveness are about recognizing humanity within ourselves and within others, even in the most likely place. Shared humanity then allows for connection, and in connection we find joy. I hope that Jonah has found some freedom and found a way to make peace with God's blessing of Nineveh so that he could find joy. Mostly because I hope that there's freedom and peace and joy available for me as well. Like the end of the Book of Jonah, this message still feels unresolved to me. It still feels like a work in progress, ending with more questions than answers. So in the spirit of Jonah's ending, I leave you with these questions to ponder. How have you experienced forgiveness? Has offering forgiveness to someone who has harmed you set you free? Can you think of an experience in which someone received forgiveness that you didn't feel was warranted? And that's what Jonah was concerned about. How did that make you feel? Have you ever received grace or forgiveness that you didn't deserve? How might being the one in need of forgiveness change the way we understand forgiveness? How might the experience of being forgiven impact our willingness to extend grace to others?